So for the people who are watching this later, Teddy just introduced himself, and then I said some more things about him because he doesn't always say all the things. But suffice it to say that he has a lot of expertise in this area, and he was about to share with us more about his conversation with Luis Gutierrez. Okay, take it away.
So Luis is actually. I thought you'd just edit the video later to put the introduction in, and nobody would even know.
Yes, but I forgot to hit record.
So Luis actually is part of University of California, San Francisco. He's part of their pandemic response team, and we've traveled a lot, in the same spaces together for a long time now. And what happened was I was thinking about reaching out to him, and right at the same time, he was one of the lead researchers of an article that got published. So it was like this moment where I was like, this is a good time. And the interesting thing about the article was that it was actually looking at outdoor recreation and twofold. So the impact of actual transmission on outdoor recreation. And so what they found in San Francisco, as kind of a precursor to this, was that they found that outdoor recreation in general had an incredibly low risk of acquiring COVID. But what was really unexpected and impressive was that in addition to like sort of the lower risk, there was also a protective factor. So you can think about acquiring COVID as there was a vacuum, right? That was a non-factor in small risk. But in addition to that, for folks who were engaging in outdoor recreation on a regular basis, they were much less likely to acquire COVID, even in similar demographics, similar risk profiles, similar behavior to other folks who were doing the exact same thing, but were not doing outdoor recreation. And for the folks who did acquire COVID, but who were engaging in outdoor recreation, they had less negative health outcomes after having COVID. So they were finding that the sort of the mental health benefits, the sort of overall well-being, the physical conditioning, all of that gave people the resources to fight the infection and then not have the negative consequences down the line. So I was like, huh. So and again, it was behind a paywall, which these things often are. So I was like, can I see that? And can we talk? And he was like, sure. So basically, I kind of gave him the exact dynamics of what you all are doing, what you historically have done in terms of what roller derby looks like in a non-COVID experience, and then what you were looking to do now. And a couple of things that he said was that's really important to keep in mind is that one-way masking with an N95 mask is incredibly effective. So it really did put the ability for folks to make decisions to protect themselves in a way that's nearly foolproof. If you're wearing a good mask, it's not worn out, you're wearing it effectively, you can, and I will give you my own personal commercial about that later. Don't let me forget that one. But it really does. And that's the difference between now and at any point in 2020 and early 2021, right? Which is people thought that masking protected others, but not you. And that was largely true because people were wearing crappy homemade, masks made of t-shirt material. But what they really know now is that N95s, if you put an N95 mask on and you are wearing it effectively, it really does. It takes the risk down to pretty close to zero. And so that's a huge change from what most folks know. And then the availability of N95 masks are, obviously not what they were in the beginning of the pandemic. And when Alex and I have talked about this a lot, the reporting about outdoor exposure, and unfortunately we have a media environment that really is clickbaity, right? But almost all research that is based on outdoor risk factors, because one of the things that Louis said was that the research to do effective research on outdoor exposure is super expensive, like incredibly expensive, because you have to control factors that are almost impossible to control. So that the research is focused on the areas that we know potentially are higher risk than outdoor activity, distance, right? Like those things. So the reason you're hearing about that outdoor doesn't carry no risk is because they're hyper focused in that environment, and they're not talking about what does it mean to be masked, what does it mean to be like distanced, what does it mean to be vaccinated, because it's super expensive, which then unfortunately creates this illusion that those are all the same thing, right? All outdoor activity is equivocable, which they're not. It's just that we don't have a public health system that invests in research of any sort most of the time. The other thing that he's particularly important was that to understand how at-home testing works, that at-home testing is incredibly valuable looking at viral load. And so that's the amount of virus circulating in your system for non-nerds who don't normally have to know this information. I have to know that. And so if you do not have enough virus circulating in your system to trigger the home test, you're likely not infectious. In particular, when we're talking about the environments that we're talking about, right? If you're in home with somebody in the bedroom, sleeping next to each other, different scenario, right? But the tests aren't going to tell you that you are actually legitimately negative tomorrow, 3 days from now. That's not what they're good at. That's why they tell you to take a test and then take another test 36 hours from now. And if you think that you have been exposed, right, to test relatively regularly. But if you take a rapid test going into an event about an hour before and that test is negative, you can be pretty confident that you are not likely to transmit the virus even if you have it, particularly if you are dealing with folks who are already vaccinated, right? And so there's this sort of like confluence of protective factors that sort of come together. And there was a lot of discussion about kind of dissing at-home tests because they're not a great predictor of future illness, right? So they're not going to tell you, like, I can confidently say that I can get on a plane and go on a vacation and get there and not be COVID positive 3 days from now. That's not what they're for, right? So, but they are really good at viral load checks and to know, like, in this moment, I want to go do this thing, and I'm pretty good to go, right? And that's one of the things that is really important to think about when going forward to design policies about like moving indoors or being in close proximity but not masked outdoors. Like those are the kinds of things that you start to think about. What can we trade one thing for another, right? Those are the things that the moving pieces that you can. It's a menu of options that you can pick and choose. For example, I will leave this. I'm trying to think about all of the things that were important to know. I mean, again, this isn't going away. And so the waiting for things to be like predictable, like down to nearly zero, that's going to be a long time off, right? So we're in a phase where it's not quite endemic, but it's this sort of quirky place that COVID lives in where it's going to keep changing and we have to figure out how to live with it, right? Like that's the place that we're at now, which is very different than 2020 when we were just, like trying to stay home and hopefully we could get a handle this. And really we're probably not for a long time. And so that then introduces other questions and other choices, right? And so that you're getting my notes and my really horrible handwriting. I'm sparing you. The other thing to keep in mind, and I don't know, are any of you public health nerds at all? Should I just assume that you're not and go from ground zero? Okay.
It looks like envy is a little bit.
Excellent. All right.
That's what we got in this room.
All right. One of the things to remember, and then again, we have a piss poor public health system, and I never expected the government to do right by me, and try to keep me alive. So I'm not terribly shocked by our current response. Deeply saddened, but not shocked, right? Like, as someone who's been living with HIV for as long as I have, and the government could really give a fuck, I don't rely on them. But we, there hasn't been the ability to kind of talk about public health from what it really is, right? Which is, how do we get the most people to do the right thing at the riskiest time, right? That actually is what public health is designed to do, right? So we have, and we, because of the culture we have this tendency to have a hyper individual focus on individual people doing individual things, right? Like, and that's not, public health is an aggregate, right? It's an aggregate of population movement. It's aggregate of interventions that you can get the most people to do. And one of the things about public health is you want the most people to do the right thing at the right time, long term. And it is impossible. It's absolutely impossible to get people to do all the things all the time, no matter what, indefinitely. It's just not going to happen. Like, we're not designed that way. And you'll burn through people's cortisol. Like, you burn through their biological ability to give a fuck. Like, that's what cortisol does, right? That's what adrenaline does. And when we push people into a permanent fear response, what we get is what we got now, right? We get people who just actually physiologically can't give a fuck because they can't muster the actual endorphins and anything else because we burned through them. And so, and we learned a lot in the HIV epidemic in terms of what do we need to do long term to get people to do the right thing as often as they possibly can, and to understand that we don't want to shame them when they don't, right? Because one of the things we learned about condom compliance was that condom fatigue is a thing, right? And there was not a lot of messaging about like condoms actually prevented HIV. We knew that, right? But there was not a non-judgmental conversation about them. They became an identity, right? It became a like either you do or you don't. And we didn't talk to people about risk management, right? We didn't talk to people about like if you both get tested, like, and you can have that conversation. Maybe you don't, so that when it's high risk, you do, right? Like, and what ended up happening a lot of the times is it's impossible. No one is going to be adherent 100% of the time, right? I've not been adherent to my HIV medication 100% of the time. It's not possible. But when people didn't use condoms, they got met with this level of shame. And what we knew happened is when they weren't compliant and they got met with judgment and shame, their condom use went down even farther because they're like, well, fuck it. I'm never going to be perfect, so fuck it. Their other risk behaviors increased. So they engaged in more risky sex. They engaged in more drug use, right? We saw all of those things go up because it impacted their self-esteem, their self-perception, and their position in the community, right? So, and we haven't done really well as a culture in taking those lessons into COVID, right? And I'm not talking about COVID deniers because I deal with those folks in the yoga and meditation world all the time, but ordinary people who are really trying to navigate this the best they can and manage well-being holistically, right? And so to be able to have a conversation that can hold nuance and understand really what public health is, right? Like, none of you individually is going to make a difference in this pandemic. It's not possible, right? But because each one of your behaviors isn't possible, right? Like, but aggregate over time, doing the right thing at the riskiest times, absolutely, right? Like, so those are the public health, the way to hold public health that is, I think it's responsible, and it allows for the elasticity of kind of humanity in a way that we haven't had a good model for that around COVID. So to keep that in mind. Let's see what else. Oh, the other thing to keep in mind, and this is just sort of, this was actually interesting, and I knew it, but I didn't know it in the ways that Louise talked about it. Perceived human beings are horrible at risk assessment in both directions, right? We often think things that are really risky aren't, and we think things that are that should be risky aren't. Like, we do the opposite of, we're just horrible at that. And so the research around perceived risk is far more tied to people's risk tolerance in life in general than it is to their actual risk, right? So for folks who have, for whatever reason, whether that's actual risk of physical illness, trauma history, temperament, anxiety, all of those things are going to be more predictive of people's perception of their risk than what they're doing and what their actual risk is. And so to be able to kind of, and it's true for all of us, right? Like, for those of us who are living with a lot of anxiety around this, it's really helpful to kind of take a look at what is my risk tolerance in general, right, in life. And so it's a way of being like, of kind of, is my response to this altogether accurate or what else gets mixed in, right? Like, and how do I start to parse that apart if I'm one of those folks who's like, my risk tolerance as a trauma survivor, right? My risk tolerance as somebody living with HIV might be that trigger might be a little bit sooner than other people, right, who don't live at the same level of risk. And so it helps to actually figure out, where do I make decisions that are behavioral, and then where do I make decisions that actually handle my emotional state that may not actually be part of my risk profile, right? And because if you don't tease them apart, you're often looking at the wrong thing that's causing stress, right? And so it's really important to kind of understand that, and for all of us individually to know where we are on that continuum is a good way of managing long-term stress around this entire pandemic. Because it's sort of like, what are we trying to fix, right? And if we can attend to both, like our emotional well-being and sort of the ways that we can feel grounded and not like our trauma triggers aren't being hit, right? And then do the appropriate things that are going to keep us and others physically safe. Those things together actually can reduce stress and help the nervous system settle. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. Let's see. I'm trying to think. I don't think that's kind of the biggies. A couple things that, because I asked him a couple things. One is, he said that scientifically there would be no reason to cancel an outdoor practice when people are masked, like none. There's just no scientific reason to do that, because there isn't like, obviously people, like folks who may, for their own actual like physical well-being or mental well-being, may make a different choice. Like, there's no shame in that. But as an organization, there isn't really the science behind that, because N95 masks work, right? Vaccinations, like all of those things together kind of add a level of protection. Now, at what point do you decide to wear masks outdoors if you're doing, closer proximity work? All of those things are things that you talk about, depending on where the numbers are and who's there, right? Do you do rapid testing versus masking, right? If you're going to be close up, and and then again, people's personal risk profiles. There should be no shame either way, right? Like that, for folks for whom they're immune compromised, someone at home is immune compromised, right? Like, mask up, do whatever you need to do, and then for folks who who are really intolerant, like masks just don't work, right? There needs to be some places where folks can actually experience being in community, being together, and not being judged, and have their nervous system settle. One of the things that we didn't talk about was that one of my specialties outside of woodworking in this is I do a lot of work around trauma, and particularly the somatics of trauma, and doing work with folks about how to manage the impact of trauma, so particularly sort of on the nervous system long term. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about is that our nervous system is meant to do this, right? Like, we're meant to be activated and come down. And if we got out of our own way, that is what our nervous system would do. If we never experienced trauma, if the system around us wasn't as fucked up as it was, our nervous system gets, like, something scares us, we fight, we flight, we flee, we come down. Like, that's what we do. And we need moments of, like, we actually physiologically need moments where our body can exhale, right? And the other thing is that for a large percent of the population, like almost everyone, that needs to have some level of social connectivity, right? Because that as human beings, we co-regulated before we self-regulated, right? Babies can't self-regulate, so someone had to rock them. We actually pick up on other people's regulation, and it's intimately connected in our biology that way. And which is one of the reasons why isolation has been devastating, right? Because we are social creatures. Even folks who don't, neurodivergent folks who don't benefit from social connection in the ways that dominant culture says they should, they still do. Right? It's just the access is different, and the look of it is different. But we are social creatures who need to be with one another, and we need to be with one another in a place that allows us to not be afraid, right? And when we can create those environments where people can exhale and their nervous systems can come down, that actually resources them long term to be able to kick into high gear when they need to, right? That's the thing that actually boosts cortisol. It actually adds to the resources so that long term you're like, fuck, we're in another spike. Okay, right? If we can make those times where folks get to have that exhale in community, we're actually making sure that they're going to be able to do the hard stuff long term, right? And so there's again a benefit to being together in a place where our bodies can actually sort of downregulate, right? And so accurate perception of risk is super important to our body's understanding when we need to be afraid and when maybe we don't need to be afraid or we don't need to be as afraid, right? And we need to really attend to that stuff because that's going to determine how we can stick with this long term, right? It's crucial. You know, it's crucial. It's been crucial sort of in the HIV epidemic, right? To do that.
Okay.
And the last thing that,
oh, sorry.
But
you have one more thing?
The last thing that, one of the things that Louise said was like, that human beings don't live zero risk lives, right? Pretty much white, wealthy, cis men think that's true, but that's not true, right? Most of us who have lived in this world in any way, shape, or form have no illusion that life is without risk, right? And so we have to be able to figure out for ourselves and then for one another in caring ways what reciprocity of risk looks like, and sort of that the risk tolerance is never, like, the risk is never going to be here, right? And it's going to be shared risk, but this expectation that we can ever get risk down to nothing in anything, it just doesn't exist, right? Like, and you know, like I stopped going to my martial arts academy at the beginning of COVID because everything shut down, and then, you know, they opened up, and it was hard. It was hard to be one of those kids who couldn't go, right? Because like I knew I couldn't go. My HIV doc was like, "No, you can't go," and it was painful. It was painful to know that other folks kind of could do that, whether it was a wise choice or not. You know, they could, right? They could take that hit if they did, and it was painful. And we got into last fall when the numbers were looking kind of okay, and I was struggling. Right? I miss being in my body in that way. Like I have asthma. Like not being in like sort of aerobic shape was hurting me, and you know, I was struggling. And my immune system is immediately tied, right, to sort of my overall stress level. And so if I didn't start doing something with my stress level, my immune system was going to take a hit, right? And I sat down with my HIV doc, and she was great about helping me make a risk assessment. And she said at some point now, the risk between acquiring COVID and the risk of depression, anxiety, right, gender dysphoria, all of those things, right, that's we're at that place, right? And one of the things we talked a lot about was the impact of suicides, the impact of overdoses, depression, mental health crises. You know, I had to stop counting the number of folks in my network who had killed themselves or had overdosed because I couldn't keep seeing that number. And it was directly related to isolation, you know, and again, because of the world I travel in, we're talking about folks who are incredibly vulnerable. And it just got to be overwhelming, and it got to be on par, right, with the folks that we were seeing who were acquiring COVID and were having negative health outcomes. And, you know, and, you know, my doc reminded me that I'd been here before. Like, you know, I had 33 T cells. Like, I was in deep, deep trouble, right? Most of you probably have anywhere between 750 and 1500. I had 33 and I named them. And, you know, and so if leaving my house was likely to kill me, and, right, I wasn't going to survive if I stayed home. So like, she reminded me that I had the skills to make those choices. And so, you know, I went back to martial arts. I wore a mask. Other people weren't. That was, you know, that was what was happening. And then Omicron hit. We made a different decision, right? And at that point, the research around masking and N95s came out. And in February, when Omicron was sort of like kind of getting a little bit lower, I went to my doc again, and she's like, go back. She's like, wear the N95 mask, no matter what anybody else does, wear it. But this is that moment where it's better for you to be there than not, right? And I was like, okay. And this is the commercial for that. And this is the commercial. I
They really
sweat.
should make you into a commercial.
I did actually email the company. I sweat, like I stand there and I soak through my uniform. I'm in a canvas jacket, basically, right? It's just, I take it off and I'm like, and it hits the floor with a splash. It's gross. So you can imagine what my mask feels like, right? It's miserable. And so I had been looking for something I could wear. And one of the folks who co-teaches with me at the academy, a graduate friend of hers from where she graduated from, had started a company called Happy Masks. And Rebecca had been wearing these masks, and she's like, they're great. Like, they're comfortable. They don't hurt my ears. And they kind of point out a little bit. I can breathe in them. Try them. And I'm like, and she's like, and I trust the science, but they're cloth, right? And they're tested to an N95 rating, but they're reusable up until 250 hours. So they're 25 bucks. They're not cheap, but 250 hours of wear. And I wore that thing religiously. Everyone else took off their masks, or they wore like cheap, comfortable masks. And Rebecca kept that heavy mask on. About a month into being back to training, the entire teaching corps tested positive. Like, and I mean everyone. Rebecca and I did not. And roller derby isn't anywhere near, like, my close friends were sitting on top of my body, strangling me. That's the level of contact that I was.
And also, it happens indoors in a space that does not have no ventilation, no way to open windows or doors. Like, this is the most high risk environment that you can possibly have.
Right? Yeah. You know, there's nothing we can do about that. And you know, and she didn't, and I didn't, and everyone that touched us that entire 2 weeks before all tested positive. And so, you know, I was like, okay, right? Like, that was like, I actually emailed the company and said, no one is ever going to put your masks through this kind of real life test. You should know it works. Here you go. And they were like, oh, thanks. I'm like, normal people don't do this, right? They just don't. And I, you know, I've continued to go. I've continued to wear the mask. Nobody else is masking because, you know, that's sort of, sadly, the business actually can't. They have no actual legal ability to make people do anything. And, you know, and so, and I, you know, I've been able to keep myself safe that way, you know. And so, but masking, I hate it. You know, as an asthmatic, I hate it. And so when I have a chance to be outside and exercising, I'm unmasked because I just can't. Like, in my nervous system can't. Like I am like always struggling when I'm at the martial arts academy because of the degree to which I'm moving, the degree to which I'm working, the degree to which I'm sweating. You know, it's like just inhaling wet air all the time. And so, like, I just can't do it outside. Like, it's just, I just don't have the stamina or the resources to do it. So again, I'm making those choices based on the science. And so that, I think, is sort of what I've got for my notes.
Great. You're so good. We do have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to read those out for the purpose of the recording. And then, of course, we're just going to talk. Okay. So I know we'll have more questions. The one thing I wanted to say before we did get to the questions is just some of the things that you said when you visited the board meeting that I found particularly helpful. And just to say them again, you might have already said them, but just the fact that I remember you saying that that outdoor risk is incredibly low, even without masks. It's pretty close to zero. And the benefit to people's mental and physical well-being definitely makes it worth the minimal risk, according to Luis. And he also said that there's no reason people at high risk can't be outside unmasked in close proximity, which I wasn't sure.
He said high risk, unmasked, distanced.
Oh, distance. That was not close metric. Okay.
Right. No, because that changes things, right? Yeah. And also like, and again, like, what people need for their own sort of mental well-being, you know, right? But that and also he said that that's the last thing. I asked him, what would the rubric be for all of you to move indoors into a space that was like a warehouse, right? So let's say, you know, Interstate 91 or the bunker, like, that was large, like I said, maybe 40 people, right? 50 people. So not like, you know, 1,000 of your closest friends and, you know, masked. I said, what would the numbers be? And he said, do that now. And he said, again, like, N95 masks are effective. And particularly if people are vaccinated, they're effective. So you could, if you had a bunker space, you could go back to being masked indoors, right? And particularly distance, you know, like, you could. And,
Right.
and so kind of keeping that in mind about the choices that you make.
Right.
And,
that was the other thing I was going to say. And then the last thing I was going to point out was that from the conversation before, you had mentioned disability justice communities,
right.
and like disabled
Right.
folks. And like, because a lot of us, and particularly those of us in PVRD, we're really, I feel like as a community, we are very invested and attuned to being able to be, looking out for those among us who are most at risk and who are not being taken into account by our government, by our, workplaces and stuff like that. And so I was, I thought it was a really good point that you made at that meeting, that you said the disability justice community isn't asking for everyone to do everything all of the time. Like you said before, like every single thing all the time forever. They are asking for everyone to be vaccinated. They're asking for everyone to maintain the access that was created during the pandemic. And that's the number one thing that those communities are asking for, because community is key to keeping people alive. So if you have online stuff, you can keep the online stuff going. Yay, that's the thing we want, as opposed to, pretending like the pandemic is over. And whenever and that's access points to begin with.
Right. And that's, he's like, and that's been the conversations I've had with folks, over the last few months. And talking about this with Alex and about like this is where disability justice actually lives is as a community, right? Is designing enough things where people have access to what they need, right? So you're never going to make one thing for everyone. You can't do it, and it's a setup to fail. But you can mindfully create all of the roads for people to access, whether it's the training, like physical movement, whether it's like social connection, any of that stuff. You can design that so that there are inroads everywhere. But where the value has to be is for folks who have the privilege, right, to move from online spaces into real life spaces. If we are a community that cares, we have to make sure that those online spaces are not only populated by people who need them, right? Like we have to make sure that those of us who have the ability to move out into the world are still populating the online spaces, so that folks who need them are benefiting from the social connection, right? So again, it doesn't mean that everyone who's going to in-person practices has to do online practices, but there should be really a conversation about what that rotation looks like, or like how do you keep those spaces alive and vibrant and not siloed, right? And that's actually where disability justice lives. It's not in curtailing somebody else's needs so that everybody gets the same thing. Like it's never been what they ask us for. And so that's a big part of that conversation. And that's actually where I think as a community, that's where the conversation can happen about how do you create a space where everyone's valued and seen and cared for, right? And not just sort of like, well, I guess, because I have no immune system, I'm here with myself. Like you don't, and that's not who you all are, right? It's just sometimes I think it takes a remembering of that's what's needed to do it, right? And
okay. So
there you go.
I'm mindful that we only have 15 minutes left until we need this Zoom room for another meeting. So Envy had a question, and I think that question is about that peer-reviewed article by Luis. Is that correct, Envy? A question about the protective factor that they found of outdoor activity. Was that due to viral load exposure or physical health in general?
I think they think it's actually more about the well-being in general. It was sorry. So the exposure likely had to do with air circulation, right? Like, and so the actual risk of acquiring COVID had much more to do with the fact that they're outdoors, there's air movement. You're not like where the risk is in outdoor stuff is like having face-to-face conversations or being at a lawn concert where like everyone's here, right? But what the protective factors were largely sort of the socializing, getting sun, right? Like physical activity, some remembrance that life can be what it was. Like, not that you're going to go back, but that, oh, right, like that there's something more than just being afraid. Like those things are what come together to create a protective factor, right?
Awesome.
So,
Did that answer your question, NB?
It did. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, cool. And then Poe asked a really good question because so when you had this conversation with Luis, this was late May, and that was almost 2 months ago now, right? We had just started having practices. We'd only been having practices for like 2 weeks. And at this point, the conversation that coaching committee is having and that the league is trying to sort of figure out is at what point can we safely start moving back toward contact, right? So contact is a different piece of the puzzle, right? So
right.
Poe asked, the question Poe asked that relates to contact is the when we said there's no metric at which there's no level of community exposure at which he would cancel outdoor practices. Is that while distanced or is that including contact practices?
And that takes you back to the masked or tested, right? So, so if you were to do, I mean, my martial arts academy is contact, so, so, right? And it's indoor. Yeah. So again, what he said and was, if you were to be outside and contact at this point in time, particularly given BA4, and 5, if you're going to be close, wear a mask. Right? Like, but you could do contact now. There's no reason why you can't. If people are masked, but and if you have a few folks for whom you have a medical exemption and they're unmasked, again, like the risk, and they're going into it knowing what their risk is, but the risk to you and the risk to the wider community spread is negligible, right? So you could. Where you start to, and again, like because of where the numbers are with like where we're at. Some of it is obviously like people's actual like sort of comfort, sort of nervous system wise and fear wise, right? Like, so if you were to say to have like unmasked but tested, right? Like, you'd still probably want to have a comparable at the same time pod where people are like masked and doing contact. But given where we are right now, the safest thing to do if you're going to be like on someone is even outside is to be masked. And I mean, like, I don't mean like 3 feet. I mean, like, like into someone. Yeah, I would, or hands face to face doing, blocking drills. Mask, you could do that today. Because again,
so to answer Poe's question, it sounds like there isn't a point at which you would cancel practice, even if you're doing those sorts of things.
Right. Yeah.
Cool.
And again, like, like wash your hands, sanitize, like all, because just because you have a mask on doesn't mean like, you're not, but,
right.
But yeah.
Awesome. Those were the questions in the chat. What else? What do other questions people have?
Oh, and the other thing is that
no, people have questions.
It was just about adding, it's expensive, but you can add rapid testing. Yeah. Like one of the things Louis said is that you can add rapid testing while people are stretching, right? Like people show up, they're distanced, they're stretching, they take a rapid test 15 minutes later. So if folks are super struggling with like close up, and it's an option to do that. It's a little bit of a fail safe in a way that it's not necessary, but it isn't another level of protection. Folks testing an hour before they get there, and I'm very I absolutely lose my mind when I hear talking about, well, can we trust people? Because there's a whole lot of a world about HIV that and policing people, and around trust that I don't have time for. So you trust your friends, like you trust people, like to not lie, because people just don't actually lie, generally speaking. So, that's
okay.
it.
Questions. I know y'all have questions. Thanks for your patience. I know you do.
I put this in the chat, but I can say it out loud now.
Oh, okay, cool.
So you slightly just touched on this with your answer to my previous question, but how does BA5 and I'm assuming future variants, which from my understanding, and like I'm in no means a public health person, but from my understanding, the variants are getting more transmissible as they're getting less deadly. So how does that connect into the discussion of, because it's also like, as we get out of the summer and into fall and winter, like we're going to have to move inside if we want to continue skating. So how, and like, I don't know, it's very forward thinking and you might not have the information or the ability to answer this, but like how
Right.
would you say all of this fits into the discussion?
Yeah, and I actually went because I knew that we were going to be talking today, and I obviously knew that the variants had changed and the conversation has changed. And I went and did some research, and um, and basically the variants are going to change, right? And we can hope to hell at some point they get more mild than they're not, right? But they're easier to spread, maybe perhaps not as lethal, but the efficacy of N95 masks aren't going to change, right? The actual permeability of that barrier, that's not what this virus does. It can, it can learn to get around your immunity. It can learn to like hop from host to host quicker, right? It can do all those things. But the ways that the molecular structure of this virus is it's not going to actually figure out how to get beyond an N95, right? Like that's incredibly unlikely given what type of virus this is, and so it's mostly that the variants are going to change, the transmissibility is going to come and go and change, but the tools that we protect ourselves with are not going to change, right? So for example, if you have not gotten your second booster shot, right, and you are like under 50, don't have any like other risk factors, like you don't have an immune disorder, you don't have like a lung vulnerability, it actually might be wise to wait until the next boosters come out because they're being targeted. They're changing the formula, right? So it's going to be more responsive to the current. It's likely to be going because the FDA. None of you need to know this, but behind the scenes, the FDA has actually. I think it's Moderna. They've approved a new Moderna formulation that is more effective against BA4 and 5. But the old version is more effective against 2.75. So it's like, it's a pick your, but what the recommendation is that for folks who are over 50, who are medically vulnerable, go get your second booster. Please do, right? That's an important thing to do right now. It's incredibly effective. But if you're like Alex, you can wait till the fall because that's actually going to help you because it'll be that variant, that we're likely to be worried about. So that's, that's sort of what the biggest thing. And again, that's what folks say. Like the biggest thing you can do for your community is get vaccinated, get everyone around you to get vaccinated, right? Those are the things that we can actually do that move public health and protection forward. But again, like the masks will work, and indoors, close contact, there is the option to add a rapid test, So does that help? Okay.
What you got, NV?
I was wondering if you happen to know, but it sounds like you kind of answered it towards the end, is that the next upgrade to the vaccine booster is that fall? Is that what you mentioned?
That's what I'm hearing. But I mean, the FDA apparently, from what I heard from the sort of like back channels of conversations about people who are in those meetings, it seems like that they've either approved it or that's like down the line, like the science looks good. And it is, it looks like it's effective against sort of the 4 and 5. But again, there's a whole lot of science about like, the 2.75 and, so, but it does look like Moderna has actually tweaked their vaccine. So there's that. So I don't think Pfizer has, or it's not, or maybe they haven't gotten it through testing all the way yet, but I'll go ask around to see where things are. Cause it changes like, every 2 days around sort of how the science shows up, yeah. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else, anyone?
Trixie and Killy, either of you have a question? Any questions? Since we can't see you, just want to make sure. How about you, Anne?
This was awesome. No questions.
Awesome.
Super good information. Super helpful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Answer the question in Happy Masks. It's actually linked in the Return to Practice Google Doc. I'm putting that link.
HappyMasks.com. Yeah.
Here. Yeah. HappyMasks.com. It's the one that I've been wearing at practice. And they come in really fun colors. if you've
If you
noticed.
don't need if you don't need an adult large, they come in great
Oh, I'm
colors.
sorry. I know. So
I wanted one with like John Deere tractors on it, but I can't have it because my face is too big.
Yeah.
I have some.
Eddie wears a
resentment.
large. I wear a medium. But the large actually fits me fine too. So but there's more fun colors in the medium.
Yeah, and I keep one that I use for like heavy duty exercise, and one I keep in the car for like going into the store, so that I don't have to smell my own sweat most of the time. Very helpful. And then I rotate them out. So the one that I used for going into the stores becomes the exercise one, and I buy a new one. So I think the last thing, if there's is I want to be really clear that this is a pandemic, and like Alex and I lost one of our closest friends. I've lost community members that I've worked with and traveled with for a long time. Like, this is no joke, and overall well-being is also no joke, right? So it's really important to kind of to understand that we are capable of holding all of those truths at the same time, despite what the dominant culture says. We are all capable of knowing that this really sucks, and right, like if we're gonna do this for the long haul, you got to take care of yourself in all the ways that you can take care of yourself. And social connection is one of those ways. Exercise, if that is your thing, is one of those ways, right? Any way that you can de-stress, do that, right? Any way that you can increase vitamin D, do that, right? The immune protection of vitamin D, so it is possible to kind of hold both of those weights at the same time. Like, it's something I've had to do for almost 30 years, right? And so I think it's easy to kind of, I'm lighthearted, and I don't think we actually benefit from making people really, really, really afraid, because that immobilizes us, right? But it's devastating, and having lived through a pandemic, epidemic that killed a lot of my friends, you got to find a way. You've got to find a way to feel joy. You've got to find a way to make connections, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Right? In the midst of funeral after funeral after funeral, if I didn't figure out how to be with people and how to love them and what was worth living for, I wouldn't be here 27 years later. There's no fucking way. So you can honor like the atrocities and honor how hard it is, and it really is okay to figure out how to live your life with this, because you're not any good to anybody else if you're not, right? So that's sort of what's important to me. So
Thanks, Teddy. And like I said, I think at some point, if folks have like questions they didn't want to ask in front of other people, or just like super nitty gritty things, or like if you're Trixie and your sister is struggling to figure out what's going on, like please, that's an actual story that happened, which is just to say that Teddy's really happy to be available. You can text me, you can Facebook message him, you can email, whatever you want to do, he's here for that. So at any point.
I am deeply invested for my own well-being at home to have roller derby survive, because he's the most extroverted extrovert I have ever met. I am deeply introverted. When you people aren't around, I have to deal with all the words. So I want him to have you. So
he's willing to join the board just because of how desperate he is for me to be able to socialize with my friends.
And I mean, I've been a martial artist for more than 20 years, and that is critical to who I am. It's actually part of the DNA of who I am, and it's part of it's one of the things that keeps me alive. So it's not a small thing to do what you love to do, and to have an embodied experience of doing what you love to do is never something to minimize. So I'm invested in keeping you all doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Teddy.
All
right. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was helpful.
Yep. Please just reach out if you need to.